Imagine waking up tomorrow as a child again, but not in the world you know. No warm bed, no breakfast waiting on the counter, no school bus, no Wi-Fi. You wake up on a rough straw mattress, if you're lucky enough to have one, in a one-room stone hut that smells like wet earth, smoke, and animals, because the animals live with you. Their body heat is the only reason you didn't freeze to death last night. You're 6 years old, and your childhood, it's already almost over. Today, we're going to take an honest, unfiltered look at what it actually meant to be a child in medieval Europe. Not the fairy tale version, not the sanitized version you got in school, the real one, the brutal, complicated, heartbreaking, and occasionally beautiful truth. And I have to warn you up front, some of what you're about to hear is going to be hard. Because for most children in the medieval world, the odds were stacked against them from the moment they drew their first breath. The first hour of life. Welcome to the world, try not to die. Let's start at the very beginning. Birth in medieval Europe was one of the most dangerous moments in a person's entire life for the baby and the mother. There were no hospitals, no sterile operating rooms, no trained obstetricians ready with an emergency C-section. A woman in labor in the 13th century would have been surrounded by midwives, older female relatives, and maybe a priest on standby, because everyone understood that death was a very real possibility. Medical knowledge at the time was a strange cocktail of ancient Greek theory, folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and religious ritual. Midwives would pray to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, and sometimes press sacred relics or written prayers against the mother's body. If things went badly wrong, the choice might come down to saving the mother or saving the child, and the church often had opinions about which soul mattered more. The statistics, reconstructed by modern historians from parish records, skeletal remains, and medieval chronicles, are sobering. Infant mortality rates in medieval Europe varied wildly depending on location and social class, but historians generally estimate that somewhere between 20 and 30% of children died before their first birthday. Some regions and time periods were even worse. Think about that for a moment. 1 in 4 or 5 babies gone before they ever learned to walk. And the ones that survived that first night weren't in the clear. The first 5 years of life were a relentless gauntlet of diseases that we now treat with a simple prescription or prevent entirely with a vaccine. Dysentery, measles, smallpox, whooping cough, diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid. These weren't rare in the medieval world, they were expected. Practically every child caught most of them, and for many, the body simply couldn't fight back. There's a reason medieval families often didn't name children for several days after birth. There's a reason many parents buried multiple children over their lifetimes without leaving behind written records of grief. Not because they didn't love them, but because grief had to be functional. You had more children coming, you had fields to tend, you had to survive. And yet, and this is important, the historical evidence also shows us tremendous tenderness. Archaeologists have found small medieval toys buried alongside infant skeletons, miniature clay animals, tiny wooden dolls, evidence of parents who, in the small ways available to them, tried to make the short lives of their children feel like childhood. We'll come back to that, but first, let's talk about what happened once you actually made it past those terrifying first years. The child's world. There was no such thing as childhood, or was there? For much of the 20th century, a theory dominated how historians and the general public thought about medieval children. It went something like this. Medieval people didn't really have a concept of childhood. The idea came from a French historian named Philippe Ariès, who published a book in 1960 called Centuries of Childhood. He argued that medieval art depicted children essentially as small adults, tiny bodies with grown-up proportions, grown-up expressions, dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing. And from this, he concluded that medieval society simply didn't recognize childhood as a distinct, protected phase of life. For decades, this view was widely accepted. It became one of those fun facts you hear at dinner parties. Did you know people in the Middle Ages didn't think of children as children? But here's the thing, it's not quite right. Modern historians have largely dismantled Aries's thesis. The evidence, when you actually dig into it, points to something far more nuanced. Yes, medieval children were expected to grow up faster than children today. Yes, they took on responsibilities and labor that would be unthinkable in a modern Western household. But medieval society absolutely recognized that children were different from adults, developmentally, emotionally, legally, and morally. Medieval law, for instance, sets specific ages of accountability. Children under the age of 7 were generally considered incapable of committing sin. They were treated in Catholic theology almost like innocents exempt from full moral responsibility. The age of 7 was a significant threshold, after which a child was considered to have entered the age of reason. Medieval medical texts, drawing on the classical tradition of Galen and Hippocrates, discussed child development in great detail. They recognized that children had different constitutions than adults, different dietary needs, different vulnerabilities. And medieval literature? It's full of children, not as background figures, but as protagonists with interior lives. Saints' lives frequently focus on miraculous or pious childhoods. Romances feature young knights in training. The Canterbury Tales gives us vivid glimpses of children in the medieval imagination. The reality is that medieval people did think about childhood. They just thought about it differently than we do. Their conception of childhood was shaped by a world where survival was never guaranteed, where every hand was needed for labor, and where the church's framework of sin, innocence, and salvation colored everything. But within that framework, children were loved. They were protected. They were, to whatever degree the brutal circumstances of the time allowed, given the chance to be children. The toys tell us that, the games tell us that, the laws designed specifically to protect children from harm tell us that. So let's look at what an actual medieval childhood looked like, day by day, year by year. The peasant child, from the cradle to the field. The vast majority of people in medieval Europe, somewhere between 85 and 90%, were peasants, serfs, villeins, free farmers, people whose entire existence revolved around the land. If you were born into a peasant family in, say, 13th century England, your childhood would have unfolded in a very specific rhythm. The first few years were spent close to your mother. Medieval mothers breastfed their children for an extended period, often 2 to 3 years, both for nutrition and as a crude form of birth control, though that understanding was intuitive, not scientific. You'd be swaddled tightly in strips of cloth, kept close to the hearth, sung to in the vernacular language of your region. Around 3 or 4 years old, the swaddling came off and you began to move independently. This was when the real socialization into your family's world began. You'd watch adults work, you'd play in the dirt outside the hut, and you'd start picking up your first small responsibilities, chasing birds away from crops, gathering kindling, watching over younger siblings. By 6 years old, you were a working member of the household. Let that sink in. 6 years old and you had a job, not in the exploitative industrial revolution sense, not yet, but in the organic, integrated into family survival sense. You helped with whatever your family did. You tended animals, you weeded gardens, you carried water from the well, you helped bring in the harvest. The harvest was the most important time of year. Everything revolved around it, and everyone, men, women, children, the elderly, worked the fields during harvest season. The fear of famine was real and constant. A bad harvest didn't mean a difficult year, it meant people died. So when the grain was ready, every pair of hands mattered, no matter how small. But here's something important that often gets lost in these discussions. Medieval peasant children also played, extensively, creatively, joyfully. We know this from multiple sources. Medieval manuscripts show children spinning tops, playing with hoops, riding sticks like hobby horses. There's a famous 13th century illustration of children playing a game that looks remarkably like leapfrog. Other images show children skating on frozen ponds using improvised bone skates, an activity that was apparently wildly popular in medieval Northern Europe. Medieval children played a version of blind man's buff. They played ball games that were the rough ancestors of football and handball. They played with marbles and dolls and wooden toys and little clay figurines of animals. They had pet dogs and cats, and the affection between medieval children and their animals is well documented. The rhythms of medieval life also gave children time. The agricultural year had its dead seasons, winter when the fields lay fallow and there was little work to be done. These were times for storytelling, for games, for the kind of idle, imaginative play that children instinctively create. So the picture that emerges isn't quite the grim, joyless labor camp that the popular imagination sometimes paints. It's more complicated than that. Children worked, yes, hard and early, but they also played. They also loved and were loved. They also dreamed. The difference is that their dreams were shaped by a world that could turn violent, hungry, and deadly without warning. Which brings us to one of the darkest realities of medieval childhood: the killers. Death had many names, and it knew where children lived. We've already talked about infant mortality, but death wasn't done with medieval children after those first terrifying years. It stalked them throughout childhood in ways that are almost incomprehensible to modern parents in wealthy countries. Let's go through the main threats. Disease was the great constant. The medieval world had no germ theory. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They understood illness through a framework of humors, an imbalance of fluids in the body, and through divine punishment or spiritual failing. The idea that tiny, invisible organisms were killing your child was simply not available to them. This meant that when epidemics struck, the response was prayer, bloodletting, herbal remedies, and, in extreme cases, the application of substances we now know to be actively harmful. Lead, mercury, and arsenic all appear in medieval medical texts as remedies. But the biggest killer wasn't plague. It wasn't even the famous Black Death, though we'll get to that. The biggest killers of medieval children were the mundane ones. Diarrheal disease, what we'd now call gastroenteritis, was devastating. A child with severe diarrhea, unable to rehydrate, could deteriorate and die in a matter of days. The simple act of drinking contaminated water was a death sentence that medieval people had no way to fully protect against. Respiratory infections were another massive killer. Pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, the medieval world called it consumption and watched it hollow people out slowly. Children packed into poorly ventilated, smoke-filled homes with no immune protection were extremely vulnerable. Malnutrition made everything worse. A child who wasn't getting enough calories, protein, and essential vitamins couldn't fight infection effectively, and food security in medieval Europe was brutally unreliable. The years between harvests, what they called the hungry gap in spring, when last year's stores were depleted and the new harvest wasn't yet ready, regularly pushed peasant families to the edge. Famine was not a historical abstraction. It was a lived, recurring nightmare. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe. Contemporary chronicles describe parents unable to feed their children. They describe desperate people eating things that would be unrecognizable as food in better times: grass, bark, dogs, rats, and in the most extreme cases, things that historical sources hint at, but scholars debate to avoid sensationalizing genuine tragedy. Children, with their smaller bodies and developing immune systems, were always among the most vulnerable when famine struck. The Black Death, when it arrived in the late 1440s, was something else entirely, something that didn't just kill, it unmade the social fabric of Europe. The bubonic plague killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's entire population in its first great wave. In some regions, the death rate was higher. Children lost parents, parents lost every child they had, entire villages were depopulated. The psychological trauma was immeasurable, and contemporary accounts from across Europe, from England, from France, from Italy, from Germany, describe a world that had literally stopped making sense. For the children who survived the Black Death, the world they inherited was fundamentally changed, and paradoxically, in some ways it was changed for the better. The labor shortage created by so much death gave surviving peasants new economic leverage. Wages rose, conditions improved, the rigid feudal hierarchy began to crack. History is rarely simple. But beyond disease and famine, medieval children faced dangers that come from something far more human and therefore far more troubling. Accidents were a constant risk in a world without safety regulations, without child-proofing, without protective equipment of any kind. Medieval coroners' records, which survive in surprisingly numbers for England, document the causes of accidental death among children with heartbreaking specificity. Children drowned in wells and rivers and mill ponds with alarming frequency. The village pond was a place of play and danger, and the youngest children had no reliable supervision. Medieval parents who had fields to work and animals to tend couldn't maintain the constant watchful eye that modern parenting culture demands. Children fell from ladders and rooftops. They were struck by falling trees. They were trampled by horses and oxen. They fell into fires. The open hearth at the center of the medieval home was an omnipresent hazard for toddlers, and burn injuries without any modern treatment were often fatal. One particularly haunting pattern that emerges from English coroners' records are children who drowned while their mothers were at work, often washing clothes at a stream or working in the fields. The child, left alone or with minimal supervision, wandered to the water. These records are not statistics, they are individual tragedies, each one a devastated family, a grief that the historical record catches for just a moment before moving on. Education and the lucky ones. Learning to read was a privilege that could change everything. Not every medieval child spent their entire childhood in fields and hovels. The medieval world had a complex and surprisingly sophisticated educational system. It just wasn't available to everyone. For the children of the nobility and the emerging merchant class, education was a central feature of childhood. And for a very specific subset of talented children from any background, the church offered something remarkable, a genuine pathway out of poverty through learning. Let's start with the nobility. The children of medieval lords and ladies led lives that were recognizably privileged even by modern standards. They were better fed, they lived in larger, safer structures, they had servants and nurses. Their mortality rates, while still shocking by modern standards, were significantly lower than peasant children. But noble childhood came with its own brutal traditions. The most significant of these was fostering. It was standard practice among the medieval nobility to send children, typically boys around age 7, girls sometimes earlier, to live in the household of another noble family. There, they would be raised alongside the children of their hosts, learning the skills appropriate to their station. For boys, this meant training in riding, combat, and knightly virtue. A boy sent to another lord's household would begin as a page, essentially a glorified servant, learning by watching and helping. Around age 14, he might be elevated to the rank of squire, serving directly under a knight, accompanying him to tournaments and eventually to war. For girls, fostering meant learning household management, needlework, music, dancing, and the social skills required of a lady of rank. It also meant being positioned for marriage negotiation, because noble girls were, in brutally frank terms, diplomatic and financial assets. The practice of fostering is one that modern readers find disturbing. Children as young as 6 or 7 sent away from their parents, sometimes to households hundreds of miles away, not seeing their families for years at a time. How did they feel about it? The historical record gives us glimpses. Some adapted beautifully, some formed deep bonds with their foster families. But medieval literature also gives us stories of homesickness, of longing, of the ache of being a child far from home. One thing that often gets lost in the medieval children had no childhood narrative is when you actually read the letters and chronicles, you find parents who desperately miss their children, who write with obvious emotional pain about the separation, who, within the conventions available to them, express profound love. The medieval world was not emotionally barren, it was emotionally complex in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate. Now, for the children who found their way into the church's educational orbit, something remarkable was possible. Cathedral schools and monastery schools were the primary educational institutions of medieval Europe. They trained clergy, but they also educated the children of wealthy patrons and, occasionally, fascinatingly, bright children from poor backgrounds who caught the eye of a sympathetic cleric. These schools taught the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The curriculum was in Latin, a second language that had to be learned effectively from scratch. This meant that the medieval student was learning not just content, but an entirely different linguistic system. By the 11th and 12th centuries, these schools had evolved into something new. The first universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. And here's the remarkable thing about medieval universities. They were genuinely, functionally meritocratic in a way that other parts of medieval society simply weren't. A boy from a poor background who was brilliant enough and lucky enough to attract a patron could attend the University of Paris and rub shoulders with the sons of kings. He was still at a massive disadvantage. He still had to navigate a system designed primarily for those with money and connections. But the possibility existed, and that possibility had enormous consequences for European intellectual history. Many of the greatest thinkers of the medieval world, Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, William of Ockham, came from modest backgrounds. Their minds were their tickets. For the girls, unfortunately, the story is almost entirely different. Women were largely excluded from formal university education. Girls from wealthy families might receive private tuition or education in a convent. Some noble women were remarkably learned. The 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen was a theologian, composer, naturalist, and medical writer of extraordinary achievement. But she was exceptional in ways that highlight just how exceptional you had to be as a woman to gain recognition for your intellect in the medieval world. Most girls, even those who received some education, were being educated primarily for one purpose: marriage. Marriage, work, and the end of childhood. How old were you? Too young. The question of marriage age in medieval Europe is one that consistently shocks modern audiences, and it should. Let's be clear about what the church law said. The minimum age for a valid marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These ages were based on the theory, derived from ancient Greek medicine, that this was when puberty occurred and the body was therefore capable of marriage. Now, and this is important, the evidence suggests that most people in medieval Europe did not actually marry at these minimum ages. Among the peasant class, the average marriage age was actually considerably older. For peasant women in England, historians estimate the average marriage age in the later medieval period was somewhere in the late teens to early 20s, which, while still young by modern standards, is very different from 12. For noble women, however, the picture is more troubling. Political marriages among the aristocracy were arranged for political and dynastic purposes, and girls could indeed be formally betrothed and even married at very young ages. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II of England occurred when she was around 6 years old, though she was not expected to live with him as a wife until she was older. These political child marriages among the nobility are real, documented, and disturbing by any modern standard. No amount of historical context makes them comfortable to contemplate. They represent the treatment of children, particularly girls, as instruments of political strategy rather than as human beings with their own futures. For working children in towns and cities, the transition to the adult world of labor came through the apprenticeship system. Around 10 to 14, a child from a craftsman or merchant family might be apprenticed to a master craftsman. This meant leaving home, again, often to live in the master's household, and entering a formal, legally binding agreement. The apprentice would work, essentially for free, for a period of years, learning a trade. In exchange, the master was legally obligated to teach the trade, provide food and lodging, and, in theory, treat the apprentice with a degree of care. The reality varied enormously. Some masters were genuinely paternal, treating their apprentices like members of the family. Guild records from medieval London show masters leaving money to their apprentices in wills, describing them with evident affection. Other masters treated apprentices as cheap labor, to be worked hard and fed minimally. Abuse was not uncommon, and guild records document cases of apprentices running away or bringing complaints against masters for excessive beatings or failure to provide adequate food. The life of a medieval apprentice was genuinely hard. The hours were long, the work was often physically demanding, and the system, whatever its virtues, was premised on the idea that a 10-year-old child was ready to begin the serious business of adult productive life. By the time a medieval person reached 16 or 17, they were, in most practical and legal senses, an adult. The concept of adolescence, that transitional period between childhood and full adulthood, with its own psychology and its own protected space for development, simply didn't exist as a social institution. That's a relatively modern invention, emerging really only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as industrial societies began to extend formal education and remove children from the workforce. This doesn't mean medieval teenagers had no inner lives, no confusion, no longing. Medieval literature is full of young people navigating the complicated territory between childhood and adulthood. But they did it without the institutional framework, without the social permission that modern adolescence provides. The hidden wonders. What medieval childhood got right? We've spent a lot of this video talking about what was hard about medieval childhood, and it was genuinely, often catastrophically hard. But I don't want to leave you with only that picture, because there are things about medieval childhood that are honestly worth looking at with a certain envy. Medieval children grew up in communities, real, functional, deeply interconnected communities, in a way that many children in modern individualistic societies simply don't. The medieval village was a social organism. Everyone knew everyone. Children were raised not just by their parents, but by extended family networks, by neighbors, by the broader community. The loss of a parent, which given medieval mortality rates happened with some frequency, didn't necessarily mean the loss of a support structure. The community absorbed and cared for orphaned children in ways that, while imperfect, were genuinely effective. Medieval children also had an intimacy with the natural world that is genuinely rare in modern life. They knew the land they lived on, not as scenery or as a place to visit on weekends, but as a living system they were part of. They knew which plants flowered in which seasons. They knew the behavior of animals. They understood weather and soil and the cycles of growth and death in a way that was experiential, physical, and profound. They had purpose. This is one of the things that's hardest to talk about without sounding romantic, but it's real. A medieval child of 10 who helped bring in the harvest knew concretely that their work mattered, that their family needed them, that the food on the table in winter was partly there because of what they had done with their hands in autumn. That kind of meaningful participation in family and community survival is something many modern children, whose lives are, in material terms, incomparably safer and more comfortable, simply don't experience. And medieval children had stories, rich, vivid, terrifying, wonderful stories. Before the printing press, before screens, storytelling was the primary entertainment technology of human civilization. Medieval children grew up surrounded by oral tradition, tales of saints and demons, of knights and dragons, of clever peasants outwitting noblemen, of miraculous interventions and terrible fates. The imagination was exercised constantly and in ways that left marks. Those stories live in us still. The folk tales collected by the Brothers Grimm, the Arthurian legends, the fairy stories that have been retold in 1,000 forms, these are medieval stories, reaching across the centuries. They were the stories that medieval children fell asleep to. The child and the church. Your soul was the most important thing you had. No discussion of medieval childhood would be complete without talking about the church. Because in medieval Europe, the church wasn't a Sunday institution, it was the operating system of existence. From the moment of birth, the church shaped a child's life. Baptism, performed as quickly as possible because an unbaptized child who died was in theological limbo, unable to enter heaven, was the first great ritual. It assigned godparents, adults who had a formal, spiritual, and sometimes practical responsibility for the child's soul. The church calendar governed the rhythms of the year. Every feast day was a holiday, a holy day, and these were the occasions for celebration, for community gathering, for the kind of collective joy that broke up the grinding routine of agricultural labor. Medieval children looked forward to these days the way modern children look forward to Christmas and birthdays, and in some ways the medieval calendar had more of them. The church also provided the framework through which medieval children understood suffering. Why did babies die? Because God willed it. Because we live in a fallen world. Because this life is a preparation for the eternal life to come. These are not comfortable answers, but they were answers, a structure of meaning that helped people survive grief that might otherwise have been unbearable. For children who showed religious vocation or whose families needed to reduce the number of mouths to feed, the church offered a path. Boys could enter monastery life as oblates, children offered to a monastery by their parents, sometimes as young as 7 years old. Girls could be placed in convents. The practice of child oblation was debated and eventually restricted in the later medieval period, but it remained a significant feature of medieval life. Life in a monastery or convent was not necessarily grim. Many medieval monasteries were centers of learning, music, art, and genuine intellectual community. Some children who entered monastic life as oblates went on to become scholars, artists, and leaders. Others, undoubtedly, found themselves trapped in a life they hadn't chosen. History is full of both. Epilogue. What their lives mean to us. They were real. I want to end with something that I think gets lost when we talk about the Middle Ages in the abstract. These were real children. Not statistics, not historical data points, real human beings with fears and dreams and favorite games and moments of pure joy. Children who loved their parents and their pets and the feeling of sunshine after a long winter. Children who were afraid of the dark and curious about everything, and sometimes unbearably cruel to each other in the way that children always are. The skeletons that archaeologists carefully excavate from medieval burial sites were once somebody's beloved child. The tiny shoes. Medieval children's shoes have survived in remarkable numbers, preserved in the foundations of buildings where they were placed as charms, were once worn by small feet running across cobblestones. The graffiti carved into the soft stone walls of medieval buildings, often childlike in their simplicity, ships and animals and geometric patterns, were made by the small hands of children who were bored or curious or simply wanted to leave a mark on the world. They did leave a mark on the world. They left it in us. Every person alive today carries, in some sense, the survival of all those medieval children who made it through the fever, through the famine, through the danger of simply being young and alive in a world that offered very little protection. The ones who didn't make it, the ones buried with their small toys, the ones whose names appear for a single heartbreaking line in a coroner's record, they were real too. The least we can do is remember them honestly, not as background figures in a romanticized fairy tale, not as data in a mortality study, but as children who lived and played and suffered and loved in a world that was harder than we can fully imagine and more human than we sometimes allow ourselves to see. If this video made you feel something, curiosity, sadness, wonder, gratitude for the world you were born into, then share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper, the history of childhood is one of the most emotionally rich and underexplored corners of the human story. We'll be going further. Leave a comment telling me which aspect you want us to cover next. I'll see you in the next one.